This is one of those occasions that I just absolutely enjoy. This is the second in a series. What this reminds me of is growing up as a kid in New York City. One of the things I used to look forward to was every Saturday going to the movie. And between the two feature films, there was always a serial. And you'd end one program with a cliffhanger about what would happen with the next one. And for those of you who were fortunate enough to have been here in October when Peter initiated the series, I think we got a very good introduction to the history of our representative government and the impact term limits has had on it. And Peter left us with the cliffhanger about what it's like being a large municipality like New York in a state like New York, where so much of what happens here is governed by what happens north of us. And so I'm anxious to hear the second installment on this four-part series. Before I do that, I want to just acknowledge T.K. Duggins, who's one of the sponsors for this series, and I think we're very fortunate that, in fact, a number of major civic leaders have stepped forward to give us the opportunity to have Peter share with us his expertise. So it's always my pleasure and delight to introduce Peter Vallone.
Thank you. Thank you, Stan. Thank you, TK, for coming. That's awfully nice of you. Those of you who want to build your money up, see TK. He's a Delaware investment company. What is it?
Durham Asset Management.
That's right. Whatever it is, it's good. And we have some really very distinguished people here tonight, in addition to my assistant professor here, Gary Altman, who is the not only the conscience of the City Council, but the brains of the City Council. Gary is here, and he'll be talking a little later. And we have a very special visitor tonight, who was if you read my book when it comes out, which will be sometime in my lifetime, I believe, but I think in the spring next year, when you read my book, I describe him as the smartest lawyer I have ever met, the most ethical lawyer I have ever met, the one who was most responsible for some of the great laws that we passed over the last decade. Now a civil court judge, soon to be a Supreme Court judge, Richard Weinberg. Richard, thank you very, very much for being here. He wrote that paragraph in the book. Anyway, what I wanted to do tonight was just to give a few-minute review of what we talked about last lecture, and then to bring Gary up, who will give you a 10-minute or a few-minute discussion of some of the specifics of what I talked about, and then leave at least 15 or 20 minutes for questions. So we start a little late, but I think it's because of the season, and we'll make up for it by talking quicker than I ordinarily would talk. But in any event, what the real purpose of this lecture is to try to get young people to understand what government in this great country of ours is all about, and get others, like myself, not to lose faith in what goes on in government, but to somehow get others to participate in it. Because this is supposed to be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Emphasis on people. It's not supposed to be a government of the elite or of a special class of people like we broke away from with the aristocracy. And for all of humankind, for all of recorded history, it's always been very, very difficult for people to govern themselves because people naturally disagree. That's part of free will. And I always start off with the prophet Micah because 3,000 years ago, the Jewish people were trying to say, well, what does God expect of us? What does he want? How are we supposed to govern ourselves? And this great prophet Micah, after consulting with God, that all that is required of you is to do the right thing, to love goodness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, it was left up to the people to decide what is the right thing to do. Okay, and that's a great question. Well, they tried dictatorships and kings and queens and emperors and everything that you could possibly imagine. And it always resulted in some kind of a huge war or battle between that particular ruling class, between the king and the parliament or whatever you had. But a couple of hundred years ago, this country was founded by people who believed that power doesn't come from a president or from a mayor or from a governor or from a legislature. And they came up with a great little piece of paper, which I considered one of the best things ever written, ever, called the Declaration of Independence. And that really is the map upon which the Constitution is based. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that we are endowed by our Creator, meaning a higher authority than anything here on earth. We are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights: life, life itself, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is what we all try to do every day. We are all pursuing happiness in one form or another. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted deriving their just power, and this is the key, first from the Creator, and where they get their power from, deriving their just power from the consent, you have to agree, the consent of the people. And the way we agree is by having elections, and whether you like them or not, that's a majority wins, and we live with whoever our elected officials are, presidents, vice presidents, speakers, and judges that we elect, and whatever else there is. But it's a great system, but what's happening in this country is that less than 20% of the people are voting in their municipal and their state elections. That's a very dangerous situation. Very dangerous situation, because if you don't have good people coming into this system, we could lose it. And that's one of the reasons why I'm doing this course, and I'm trying to explain how important it is that you participate in a system, even if you don't necessarily like the people that are in it. You change the people that are in it. We all have that magnificent power to vote. Going into that, last time we discussed about, balance of powers. How do you ensure that one person doesn't become so strong, a president, a mayor, a governor, that he or she is going to dictate and dominate? And that's what they came up with, a strong legislative branch that makes the laws, called the Congress, or in the city of New York, the City Council, and a strong judicial branch, which interprets the laws when there's a clash between those two branches. What a great idea. What a wonderful idea. Imagine if you had to figure out how to make government work. I mean, what better way than try to balance it so that no one branch ever becomes so powerful? And a great city of New York, which would be one of the strongest countries in the world all by itself, certainly every one of our counties, where I come from, Queens County, would be the 19th largest state, just to put things in perspective. This is a great textbook and example of how this balance of power should work. And we had this old group called the Board of Estimate, which Richard helped throw out with his magnificent briefs as a co-counsel and as submitting briefs when we went, the case was brought to the United States Supreme Court. We got rid of the Board of Estimate, which used to run the city, because they didn't give the people any power, the people through their legislators, who they elect from their various districts. And that was changed in 1989, and I was privileged to be the first speaker of the new empowered city council, which now had true balance and which began the process of reforming the city of New York. We took ourselves out of bankruptcy back in the dark days. We rebuilt our law and order. We built our police force. We changed the policy of the homeless, not to just to warehouse them in huge places, but to try to have a transitional process where they can actually get back into a home, to try and change welfare so that doesn't become a way of living forever, but try to get people trained and to give them the means to make a livelihood and to get themselves out. The policy when we first took over was, don't do anything for the homeless. Let them stay on the streets because they'll go somewhere else. And you can't make it too nice, because if you make it too nice, they'll come from all over. And we proved just the opposite. The more you help, the quicker they get off become homeless, and the quicker they go back into society. First, you have to find out what the problem, but that's a whole new thing. Anyway, we reformed things, and then a well-meaning billionaire by the name of Ronald Lauder comes along, and he ran for office against Rudy Giuliani in the Republican primary about 15, 16 years ago. Spent $14 million, got 14,000 votes, and was creamed. Well, he got really ticked at that, and he said, we got to change the system. So he came up with what's called term limits, and he launched it throughout the nation. It was Republican. Republicans loved it because most of the Democrats are in office. It's the only way they can get them out. So they embraced term limits. But you couldn't do it to Congress because that's unconstitutional. You couldn't do it in a state legislature because that's unconstitutional. So where could you do it? City of New York. Let's get them. And everybody knows somebody that they hate in government. So they figured this is a good way of getting rid of a president. But all they were doing was getting rid of the new empowered city council, which was doing a great job over 12 years, which had brought the city to a pretty good situation, working on a balanced thing, and they threw everybody out at the same time. And left us into a situation where one of the greatest crises that ever occurred, 9/11, was all new people. People who don't, just think of your own business or whatever you do. If everybody left at the same time, I'm sure there's a lot of qualified people who could take your place. But how long would it take them to learn what you already know? How long would it take them to make the same mistakes you made and would not repeat? And that's pretty much what happens. And what's happening when you throw out a whole legislative body at the same time. And so that's a whole thing. We talked about term limits. We talked about the difference between a very powerful mayor who comes into office and has everything at his or her disposal, everything. An army, has a news conference every time you burp, do anything you want. From the first day you're in office. Great lawyers at your disposal, civil service there for you, anything you want, as against if you were elected a city council member. If you're elected a city council member, you have no one working for you, you have no office, and you have to wait till you get together with the rest of the council members to elect someone to lead, called the speaker, who then can hire people, can get you staff, can get you officers. How long does it take to get that body together so it could stand up together and face the chief executive, who has a $40 billion budget, who comes up with all kinds of ideas, like, for instance, what we just had, nonpartisan elections. I want to put on a ballot nonpartisan election. Sounds like a great thing. Nonpartisan election really sounds nice. Why should just Democrats vote for Democrats and Republicans vote for Republicans? Why can't they just vote for whoever they want? This way you don't have a big party system. This way the best person could win, theoretically. The problem is that the reason you have parties is to have that consent of the people, have them be able to stand up to moneyed interests. If you're a billionaire or have lots of assets, financial assets of any kind, you can make your own party. You can pay people to go out and get petitions for you. You can buy the media. You could buy television time. You could buy an election, unless you have an organized way of getting other people involved who volunteer their time and who don't get paid this kind of stuff. And one volunteer is better than 10 paid people, incidentally. But in any event, that's balance. So the people were smart enough to vote that down in the thing, even though ostensibly it looks like it's a good thing. So that brings us to where I wanted to be tonight, which is this great city supposedly has home rule, meaning that when it comes to things that affect the property, what is the language? Property, thank you very much, Judge. The property affairs and government. The city is supposed to have control of its own destiny. One of the greatest examples of the difference between politics, which is the vehicle that the people are supposed to use to get into government, and once you get into government, the end, the vehicle is politics, the end is government. The end, when you get in there, you're no longer Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal. You are now the president, the mayor, a council member. You are now supposedly doing what's best for all of the people, not just for the party that put you there until the next election. So we have politics, we have good government. We have the vehicle, and we have the end. The end, unfortunately, in Albany, has turned completely upside down. Instead of politics becoming the vehicle to get you into government so that you could do the right thing for all the people, government has become the vehicle for politics to take over. And decisions are now not made for what's benefit of all the people. Decisions are now made of what's good for the Democratic Party, what's good for the Republican Party. What a ridiculous situation. What an absurd situation. And the height of arrogance occurred when we had what's called a commuter tax, but it's not a tax, it's a use fee. There are 21 major cities in this country, not counting states, that have a personal income tax to help balance their budget. And in every situation where you're called upon to pay an income tax because you work in the city of New York and you live in the city of New York, people who don't live in the city of New York, or whatever city we're talking about, who come into that city and utilize the services, utilize the protection, utilize the hospitals, utilize everything that we pay for, they are asked to pay a small proportion of that income tax called a commute use fee for using the services. It amounted to half the price of a token. Half the price of a token. I campaigned for governor in all 62 counties of this state. No single human being anywhere outside the city of New York ever said, what's your position on a commuter use tax? Or we oppose the commuter use tax. No one ever mentioned it. Shortly before 9/11, several months before 9/11, we had an opening. This is really fascinating, and very few people even know about it. If they did, they would rise up and protest. But in any event, we had a senator by the name of Joseph Holland in Rockland County, a Republican candidate, a Republican incumbent senator. We have a Senate in the state of New York that has approximately a 7-majority Republican domination with a Republican president of the Senate by the name of Joseph Bruno. We have an assembly, and a candidate that was replacing Joseph Holland was named Social Services Commissioner by Governor Pataki, creating a vacancy. To fill that gap, the person who was going to run for that office, the Republican who was going to run for that office, was named Thomas Morahan, not Monahan, Morahan, okay? And he was an existing assemblyman, a pretty powerful guy. Everything's perfectly fine. So we have now a strong candidate on the Republican side to take this Senate seat from Rockland County. On the Democrats say, you know, we have a shot at this. Maybe we can start whittling down that 7-member majority. This is all politics. So let's get a strong candidate. And they got the strongest candidate they could find, a nice guy by the name of, these are all nice people incidentally. I don't mean to talk about any. His name was Kenneth Zabrowski. And he was the leader of the Rockland County legislature. So fairly well-known Democrat. So you had 2 well-known people running against each other for this vacancy. Fine. Who cares except people in Rockland County? Okay. Now, the Republican who's running said, you know something? There's a commuter tax. Why should people who live in Rockland County have to pay a tax just because they live in? I'm going to oppose that. I'm going to introduce a bill. Who cares? This is just politics. You know, fine. Nobody likes to pay a tax. Somebody said to you, you want to get rid of a tax? You say, sure. Which tax can we get rid of? And this is what, so he takes this position. Now, the Democrat, Zabrowski, says, well, I don't want to pay a tax either, because he wants to level the playing field. So still, it's all politics. Nobody really cares, except people in Rockland County. In any event, then Joseph Bruno, the head of the state legislature, Senate, says, you know, this is kind of dangerous. These Democrats are talking about taking control of the Senate away. So what I'm going to do is really stick it to them, and I'm going to pass a one-house bill. Now, a one-house bill means nothing unless the other house passes it and the governor signs it. So he passes this. Now, I'm the speaker, and Mayor Giuliani's the mayor. We said, what, are they nuts? And we run up to Albany. Now, this is before 9/11. We're doing pretty good. We have a balanced budget. We have a $1 billion reserve. But this is $500 million a year of recurring revenue. Recurring. It's so important to have recurring revenue. If you're living on a budget and somebody gives you $1,000, say, here's a present of $1,000, that's wonderful. But you're not going to get that present again next year for $1,000. So you can't really budget it. You could only spend it maybe buying a refrigerator, but you can't depend upon $1,000 every year. But this is money every year, essential in our budget, tremendously important in our budget. So we both go up there and say, you can't do this. This is ridiculous. They said, don't worry. He says, Joe Bruno says, don't worry about it. He says, they'll never pass it. The Democrats in the Assembly will never pass it. Sure, they'll never pass it. We go over to the other side, and the Speaker of the Assembly, Shelley Silver, says, you know what that bum did? He's putting us, what do you think this is politics. I'm not going to let him get away with that. I'm passing it too. Go see the governor. So we go to the governor. Governor, you're the governor of the state. You can't let the largest city in the state, that's the economic engine that drives the state, and to a great extent the country, take a hit like this. You can't take $500 million out of our budget. What, me? Vote in favor of a tax? Of course not. If that's on my desk, I sign it. Press couldn't care less. Nobody in the city understood or cared. Nobody understood that what happened here was strictly politics. Had nothing to do with what's good for the people of the city of New York, or really, for that matter, of the state. Right. Governor signs it. Now we go to our great lawyers. Say, how could you do this? There's 3 branches of government, don't forget. The state has just violated our home rule. And Richard says, you're absolutely right. They have no right to do this. And Gary Altman, who's another great lawyer, says, you're absolutely right. So we marshal all our legal forces, Giuliani, the mayor's side and the council side. We are together on this, although we're apart on many other things, but we're together on this. And we go into court, confident that they couldn't possibly allow this to happen to our great city. After all, we have home rule. And this Court of Appeals, the highest court in the state, says home rule is whatever the state says it is. They could do anything they want. And right after that, to show you how bad politics is and why we have to change it, right after that, the greatest and most terrible single horror that ever occurred was visited upon this great city. 3,000 people in one fell swoop died. 100,000 jobs in just 2 buildings disappeared. Another several 100,000 jobs around those buildings disappeared. Apart from the human factor, which could never be replaced, the economic hit on this great city, it's the only city in the world that could have survived that kind of a terrible economic. It meant hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars taken out of our budget just like that. Now, when there was a disaster in San Francisco, an earthquake, just a couple of years ago, no one had to ask the governor or the state legislature to help. They immediately passed a statewide assessment to help rebuild San Francisco. What did the state and the governor do for the city of New York? Does anybody know? Nothing. 0. Now, the mayor, brand new, and the council, brand new, had no idea what they were facing up in Albany. That their goal is political. Obviously, this mayor and this council thought they would do the right thing. They certainly will give us back the commuter use fee because it doesn't affect their budget 1 penny, not 1 penny. It doesn't affect their budget at all. Give us back at least that $500 million. And what are you going to do besides that? How else are you going to help the city? So the mayor and the council, to a certain extent, relied on promises made by the big 3 up in Albany. Don't worry, right after the next election, We'll be there to help you. Everybody had tears in their eyes on September 12th. The president came and promised billions of dollars, which we're having problems with right now. Governor, state legislature, we have no promise. After the election. After the election, the mayor, figuring they were going to help us, takes the very small community tax that we had, $500 million, and says, well, at least make it $2 billion, because we have such a tremendous, just to make up for the money that we lost. Instead of getting $2 billion, they didn't get 2 cents. Nothing. Not only did they not give the community use fee back, but the governor in his proposed budget says, we're going to help you, the city of New York. The Congress and the president have guaranteed $1 billion to you. Here, we're going to give this to you. But governor, you have nothing to do with that. That's federal money. Oh, no, well, it's passing through the state. And that was the budget he proposed, which we couldn't believe. I say we, meaning since I wasn't in government at the time, but the people in government couldn't believe that. So the state then he goes away. He leaves. So that the state legislature, for the first time, at least that I know of, adopted its own budget. Not giving us the community use fee, but attempting to give about $500 million by saying they were going to pay off some of our bonds over the next few years, which was a little bit of help to the city. The governor sued to stop that. He says, we have a budgetary problem. We can't give any money to anybody. So where we are, folks, is that 3 well-meaning people, and there are well-meaning people up there, because of the lack of public attention and the lack of accountability, were able to say to the city of New York, you have a problem, we're going to help you. Here's how we're going to help you. Raise your taxes. We'll allow you to raise your own taxes. Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that one way of balancing a budget is to raise taxes. But you have to be a total idiot to think that that's the only way they could have helped. So in terms of politics against good government, if something like this could happen and no one seems to rise up in protest, what else could happen? Unless you get interested again, unless we get people interested again, unless we get people saying to their representatives, I don't care whether you're Republican or Democrat, it has nothing to do with this. What are you doing? If we tried to do this in the city of New York, which is the center of media attention of the world, we probably would have been indicted and thrown away, because you can't really do anything in City Hall without there being a great amount of attention on it. And the press really rises up. And that's going to be my next lecture, the power of the press and the power of the media. If they really want to do something, they can do almost anything they want. They can create you very quickly, and they can destroy you even quicker. They love to do that, up and down, all around, as long as it gets attention and as long as it sells papers. But in any event, one way of affecting this, one is that campaign financing that we discussed last lecture was one way of leveling the playing field by having public funds come out. If you agree not to spend more than a certain amount of money and abide by certain principles, you'll get public funds so you don't have to be a very rich person to run for office. That's campaign financing. But everyone who is among the people has to raise funds. We were just at a fundraiser last night that we were talking about for my own son. Everyone has to raise funds. And everyone has to go to the people and say, look, I want to be a council member, I want to be an assembly member, I want to be a senator, and this is my platform, this is what I want to do, and this is how I want to do it. Would you please help me? Can you afford $10? Now, in the city of New York, $10 becomes $50 because there's a 4-to-1 match, which is great. So we're encouraging small contributions to match the big people who don't have to to go have to do this. A lot of people can afford $10 or $25. Not everybody can afford the big kind of money that others raise. In any event, am I scratching again here? Where's my man? But in any event, so one of the things I'm recommending is I've sent a letter to every state legislator and everyone up there saying, you want to come to the city of New York to raise money? You know, you need money? Fine. What are you doing to help the city? What are you doing? What's your position on a community use fee? I refuse to call it a tax. It's not a tax. What's your position on a community use fee? What else are you planning to do? Perhaps we might be able to get the attention of our officials up there to make them accountable. What are you doing to help? Same thing with our Congress members. As we talk to you right now, the city of New York gives billions of dollars more to both the federal government and to the state government than it gets back. Senator Moynihan, one of the greatest senators that we've ever had, every year would come out with a detailed analysis of the amount of money that we are being discriminated against. Even for the terrorist money that Congress appropriated, they decided to go on a per capita basis, meaning that the average New Yorker gets $5.39. The city gets $5, and members of the state, to utilize in trying to protect against a similar terrorist attack as happened before. If you live in Wyoming, you get $139 per person. It's nonsense. I don't think Wyoming is a target of terrorists. God, I hope not, anyway. But in any event, it's just not fair. It's just the discriminatory formulas have never been fair when it comes to the city. And we've got to get more. If all of our Congress members were united in one situation, if all of our assembly members and senators, if they live and work in this, if they are elected from the city of New York, if they forgot their party politics and stood together, then they'd have to give us back the community use fee. And they would have to start leveling the playing field. One example I'll give you. Then I'm going to turn it over to Gary. One example I'll give you. Medicaid. Medicaid is a federal program. The federal government says, if you want to participate in Medicaid, and everybody does, those are people who have no money whatsoever to pay for any kind of medical bills. If you want to participate in Medicaid, we will give you half the money it cost you. So state of New York, we're giving you $6 billion. Now you match it. And that'll cover the entire Medicaid bill in the state of New York. The state of New York says, okay, but we're going to have half of that payable from taxes from the city of New York. So the state of New York insists that the city of New York pay half of the Medicaid bill. The only one in the country that does it. That inequity alone is $3 billion for the city that it should not have to be spending. That alone. Just one thing. We won't talk about transportation. We won't talk about education, where the courts have already decided that they have to change it because it's unconstitutional, it's illegal, it's immoral, it's everything. The school formula. Just one example. It could and should be changed. It has to be changed. It'll take time, but it'll also take education. It will take people understanding what's going on and doing something about it. It will take the people whose consent is required for government to work, to stand up and make accountability the key. Otherwise, it's going to get worse. If we can't get more than 20% of the people to participate, it'll get worse. And there's no way that we can let the greatest formula for governing that any human minds have ever been able to come up with just go down a tube. I'm going to call upon Gary now, Gary to fill in some of the statistics that I left out, and then we're going to open up the questions. We even have a microphone back there, and we're right on time. Come on up. This is Gary Altman. Thank you.
When the, excuse me, when the governor signed the commuter tax, he put out a press release, as he does on most bills, and in this case, he was very proud to say how by eliminating the tax, we're returning millions of dollars to hardworking New Yorkers. He didn't mention the hundreds of millions of dollars that New York City was going to lose. The assemblyman from the Democrats in Nassau County, Tom DiNapoli, he said people who travel into New York City deserve a break from this onerous tax. Again, he didn't take into account, if you want to work in New York City, obviously the wages that are earned in New York City are much greater than those earned elsewhere. If you want to stay in Rockland, you can stay in Rockland and earn maybe $45,000 compared to $80,000 or whatever that amount is. But the tax that we charge for the commuter tax was not raised since 1976, and it was 0.45 of 1%. So someone who earned way above the average and earned $100,000 paid a commuter tax of $450. So as Peter said, it was well under the cost of a token. Someone earning $70,000, $80,000 was paying $300 a year in a commuter tax. It surely wasn't enough for them to say, oh, this onerous burden. Yesterday, Westchester announced that they're proposing, I believe, a 10% tax increase in their real property tax to balance their budget. Now, if you know anyone who lives in Westchester, their taxes are $6,000, $8,000, $10,000, $15,000 a year on average. $1,500 increase, they didn't think twice. Last year, Nassau County recommended a 33% real estate property tax increase. Ultimately, it didn't happen, but that's fine there. But to say that they're spending that money in New York by going to the theater, buying lunch, whatever, is not the case, because as Peter said, we provide hospital service. EMS comes when you call. Our libraries, the library by City Hall is packed with people who live in the suburbs, who live in the city. You work here, you can use our libraries, our sanitation, our police. This is a place they want to work, and we're the ones being penalized. What they forgot was that once they did away with the tax for Nassau, Rockland, Westchester, and the surrounding counties, what about New Jersey and Connecticut? So when the case went up to the Court of Appeals, and the Court of Appeals said that we didn't need a home rule, I'd like to get into that in 1 minute, you don't need a home rule. They also said, but New York City violated the U.S. Constitution because they separated out a class. You can't treat New Jersey and Connecticut differently from how you're treating the residents of New York State. So by the way, you're now going to lose another $115 million. So it wasn't just the savings of these individual people in the hundreds for the most part. It was that we lost another $115 million from those out of state, which we then had to refund because it was a retroactive. When the court decided a year later, it was retroactive to when we enacted the original tax. So again, the city was losing, and Albany could have said, hey, by the way, we'll give a tax credit for how much you pay to the city. Take it off your state taxes. We'll increase the credit. No, instead, we're just going to eliminate the tax. The question came up about what exactly is a home rule? A home rule, and this has been going on since the early 1800s, that the cities in the state have tried to get more power away from Albany. This idea of properties, affairs, and government goes back to the 1820s. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was required that before the state acted in certain areas, they had to get a majority vote of the city council if we had the mayor's approval, and if we didn't have the mayor's approval on an item, we had to get a 2/3 vote. But they had to come to us. Here, they of course did not come to us to ask us for a home rule, yet if I give you some of the examples of where they do come to us, you'll see that if a widow has lost her property because she's failed to pay taxes for 2-3 years, and we're about to auction off that property, and now a bill is proposed to say, let's help this widow or anyone who had some bad luck. Before your property is auctioned off, we'll let you pay your taxes back $2,000, $1,800, $3,000, and you can buy back your property. Albany won't let us pass that law without a home rule. So they take a very minor things. If they're thinking of building a water filtration plant up in the Bronx, and we may or may not want it, it's around Bronx High School of Science, Jerome Park Reservoir area, it's around some very large middle-income co-ops. Albany requires a home rule. They could have just declared that area parkland and said, we're not going to do it, we're going to do it. But then when it comes to something that's $500 million, as Peter said, all of a sudden the home rule is not needed. But this fight between Albany and the city, and maybe perhaps other cities, has been going on for a long time, and courts have often ruled against the city. Years ago, they ruled that in one case, that the sewers of New York City were not in the jurisdiction of New York City. They really were a state mandate. They ruled that transit workers were not in our jurisdiction. So they find many areas where they make these decisions, what and what is not in our jurisdiction. But the simple process of getting a home rule is there's a form. It's one-sided. It takes about 10 words. You just take the bill, you fill in a title of the bill, and after the council passes it, the city clerk, just puts a stamp on it, and we send it up to Albany. And that's the entire process for a home rule. And generally, if we talk about taxes, even when we give a home rule, Albany generally does not raise taxes. What they often do with a home rule is they will give us the authorizing legislation to raise taxes because they don't want to be on record as actually raising the taxes. But once they give us that authorizing legislation to raise tax, by its very nature, it also gives us the opportunity when we want to lower those taxes. This is another example where we weren't given that opportunity to make that decision. It was taken away from us. Because the only two areas that the city of New York can act on without Albany's approval in the area of taxation are real property taxes and the commercial rent tax, which is a tax that's the right to rent property in New York City you were taxed on. And over a period of his 15 years as Speaker, Peter kept moving to eliminate this commercial tax. For the right to work in the city and have a business, why should I pay tax on my rent? And over time, we eliminated throughout the 4 boroughs. We eliminated in most of Manhattan. We kept raising the amount of rent you can earn because these were taxes that we had the ability over, and those are taxes that we generally did not need Albany's approval, but for 10 years we did not, until after 9/11 in the new council, we never raise property taxes, and we actually lowered the commercial rent tax.
Thank you very much, Gary. And could we have the pleasure of Judge Weinberg, who has to leave. Judge, would you like to make a few comments here?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I'm speaking in my unofficial capacity as a former general counsel of the city
Absolutely.
council. And I'm a criminal court judge, Peter, not a civil court.
Oh, that's correct. I
That's
forgot
right.
about that.
But if you want to get me promoted to state Supreme Court, I will take that.
That I like.
Okay, Dean Altman, Mr. Speaker. Let me make a couple of points. Number one, the municipal home rule law doctrine says in simple terms, if it's a matter of local concern, the power should rest with the city. If it's primarily a matter of state concern, the power should rest with the state. And as the Speaker and as Gary correctly pointed out, it is what they say it is. So some person called a home rule counsel up in Albany who works for the majority leader of the state senate or the Speaker of the Assembly decides whether or not you need a home rule. And it's arbitrary, it's capricious, and it's not really consistent at all if you look at the patterns. So, for example, when the commuter tax was first created, and over many years when it was reestablished, periodically, there was always a home rule message required. So in the legal briefs that Mike Hess, who is Rudy Giuliani's corporation counsel, and I wrote together as co-plaintiffs for the mayor and for the Speaker, we made it very clear. How come you needed a home rule message to create the tax? How come you needed a home rule message time after time to reestablish this tax? But when you wanted to bag it, to destroy it, to rescind it, all of a sudden you didn't need a home rule message. It's both intellectually and legally inconsistent. Another example, by the way.
But they said no.
But they said no. Proving that sometimes
Richard always said, well, they're wrong. But
they're
that's
wrong.
the
That's right. But I'm not on the Court of Appeals yet. All right. Another example, by the way, of home rule is on the Staten Island secession case. The Court of Appeals made it very, very clear that if Staten Island was going to attempt to secede from the city of New York, you could not do that unless you got a home rule message from the city council and from the mayor. The reason they were happy to do that is because they were able to duck a dangerous political problem by putting that on Peter Vallone's shoulders because he was the one who was blocking the Staten Island secession. Now, if Peter didn't have the intellectual and the moral and political courage to do the right thing, which he'd have today, without any doubt at all, is Staten Island would secede, which doesn't mean very much in terms of the economic or political viability of the city, but also means that Manhattan could leave the rest of the city. And it does matter if Manhattan leaves, because Manhattan is the economic base of the city of New York. So if Peter didn't have the courage to do the right thing and say, no, you need a home rule, and we litigated that, and we forced that, and we won that, you would have no city of New York today. The city of New York would be a historical footnote. Also, let me point out two other phenomena about the power of Albany that didn't come up tonight, but I think is very, very important. If the state legislature passes a law and it occupies that field, that's called preemption. And that preemption can come one of two ways. One, either by express preemption, where they specifically say in the legislation, we hereby preempt this area, and the city and local governments cannot regulate that. Or it can be by implied preemption, which means they have so occupied the area that any local regulation will create a hodgepodge of legislative enactment, and therefore you can't do it. So if the state government wants to take New York City and control New York City's destiny, they pass a state law, and they either have express or implied preemption. And the city of New York is, again, precluded from legislating on its own destiny. Another way they have of doing this, and this is probably one of the dirty little secrets of government, is the creation of state public authorities. State public authorities, which are either under the control of the city elected officials, are not in the budget of the city of New York, that don't go to the larger public policy concerns of the city of New York. You create a public authority, and it's out of the zone of local governmental control. Want an illustration? Why don't you take the Metropolitan Transit Authority? What control do we have over the increases to the subway fare? None, because the public authority, controlled by the state government, decides what to do about that. What control do we have over the land use over Battery Park City, which is the most important economic land use package ever created in the Northeast and perhaps the country? None, because a public authority called the Battery Park City Authority controls it. What control do we have over our own financing in the 1973-74 fiscal crisis? Did we have? The answer is none, because we created a municipal assistance corporation and the bonds coming out of that. Again, everything that had to do with the city of New York's destiny was controlled by public authorities. And the other problem is, and there's another unspoken rule with respect to how Albany controls the city, is that the legislature can create a series of legislative enactments which are called unfunded mandates, which means that they tell the city of New York, you shall have so much in a class size, so many security guards at a hospital, so many taxi cabs on your streets, and you have to pay for it. It's an unfunded mandate. So in all those ways, directly or indirectly, they control our destiny, and we're the economic engine. The city of New York, with all due respect, does not need the state of New York. Again, I'm speaking in my unofficial capacity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you very much, Your Honor. Now, questions, but just before we say that, that is another topic, secession, that we are going to seriously consider as we go down the road. Just identify yourself for the record.
Speaker of Honor, I'm Michael Myers, the Executive Director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition.
How are you, Michael?
Excuse my code.
It's okay.
But the theme of your talk tonight was the consent of the people, the consent of the governed. But yet still, politicians sometimes don't get the sentiment of the people. They become arrogant in office, and they think they themselves to be indispensable. For example, Mayor Giuliani, 9/11, thought he was indispensable and wanted to extend his term in office. The people, through the newspapers, through media, through telephone calls, through the candidates who were running for mayor, said, no, get out. The people, you say Ron Lauder, forget his billions and forget Bloomberg's billions, because Bloomberg's billions couldn't change the city charter in terms of nonpartisan elections. Ron Lauder's billions, whatever, didn't tell the people how to vote, didn't dictate the people how to vote. The people voted twice in referenda, 4 term limits. The mayor the city officials, and yes, the city council. Yet still, even after the people voted twice in referenda for term limits, the city council, which you led, had a 10-year and said, oh, no, 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 no. The people didn't know what they were voting for. Oh, no, 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 no. That's not what the people meant. And the city council even dared to try to overturn the people's referendum on term limits.
Well,
Now, I'm going to say to your credit, this is where you come in, to your credit, and maybe because
I need to get to a question.
I'm going to put the question to you. It may be because you were running for mayor, but to your credit, you stood in the city council and told them to do the right thing, and that is not to overturn the people's referendum. But my point is, isn't everything politics? I mean, you talk about
To get
you
into
talk about a
office, yeah.
court decision. In New Jersey, the courts 30 years ago talked about school financing and what we just said today in New York. But they've been litigating the issue of school financing equity for 30 years. Everything's politics. It goes to the legislature, it goes to the executives, it goes back to the people.
Justice is slow, Michael, but it eventually gets there. You know, it gets there with Brown against Board of Education. Sometimes it takes a century, but it'll get there. And that's why it's so important we have the balance. Do we agree with them? No. The greatest lawyer I ever met says the Court of Appeals is wrong on this home rule, and I happen to agree with him. But, you know, there's always a precedent for it. But I just want to clear something up. The council did not throw out term limits. What the council did do was to adjust so that everybody's served. Okay, all right.
I have the privilege of serving 9 years on the city council, along with the speaker. Unfortunately, they abolished my office. I had to find work elsewhere, and mayors were good enough to appoint me.
We didn't abolish you, Henry, just the office.
Right. And I think what you said was terrific about the state dominating, exploiting the city, and really not supporting it financially, but causing it additional financial burdens. And I know you tried to change that when you ran for governor, and if you had won, it might have been more equitable in terms of certainly the way the state dealt with the city. But what happened when Mario Cuomo was governor for 12 years? Was the city treated better than it was when George Pataki was governor? And I don't know the answer to this question.
One thing, Henry, let me help you with that. Mario Cuomo, to his great credit, at the end of his term, had reached an agreement with both sides of the legislature to phase out Medicaid burden placed on the city over a 10-year period. That would have saved us today $4 billion. So what Mario did to get both sides of the political fighting warriors up there, actually to do that was a tremendous thing. And the only reason I think that worked, and one of the reasons I hope it'll work again, is because it isn't just New York City, it's all the big cities in the state. Buffalo, Syracuse, all of them have that same kind of a burden that we have. So that got the kind of permission. So that was one of the great achievements of Mario, which was immediately wiped out as soon as there was a change.
I see. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. It was a pleasure to have you here.
Oh,
I have trees named after me because of you, and I appreciate that.
Well,
Thank you,
let me
Henry.
just say, the speaker, in his years, the speaker was always a great friend of trees.
He
could be
actually
counted on.
counted the trees in his city, New York.
Right.
And I'll never forget that. That was a
497,000.
Yeah.
And, it was a
Thank you,
pleasure.
Henry.
Okay.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Henry. One of the great public servants of our city. Thank you.
Before I ask my question, I'd just like to say I'm enjoying this evening. I'm enjoying the
Thank you.
speakers, and the information being given, and I regret the fact that I wasn't at the prior meetings. I'm looking forward to coming to the next meeting when you talk about secession, because I remember when Jimmy Breslin and Norman Mailer
Yes.
ran.
They ran on that platform.
On that
But next,
platform.
next is going to be about the media. We'll bring
No,
in
I
secession.
understand, but the future. But my question is maybe the reason the 20% only are voting in the elections is the fact, or part of the reason, is the public authorities that have such power, such as the MAC and such as the MTA raising the fare, are individuals who are not elected into office. They seem to be the individuals who have all of the controlling power in so many of the economic engines that support, or I should say, economic foundations that support this city.
Well, there's a good reason for that, and it's always a balance. There was a time when many of the public officials, elected officials, were corrupt in the city of New York. And
No.
Yes. It was an image that it took me a long time to change. The council used to be known as the den of thieves, and it was terrible. It had a terrible reputation. But that changed, and I can truthfully say, although it may seem like I'm going after Silver or Bruno, I'm not, or Pataki. I'm really not. These are good people. They really are. It's just that they need a refocusing again on what that's there for. Forget the politics. No one really cares about that. Yes, it is important. Otherwise, you wouldn't have gotten there in the first place. But you're there now, and do what's good for everyone. The authorities, in many sense, took away from the greedy boss tweeds of the world, the ability to siphon off this money, put it in their pocket. But what's happened is you're absolutely right. They become so powerful, they're beyond us. We can't touch them. It's too much. The balance has gone too far. And it really should have to come back. Who can do it? Only the people who created them. That's the state legislature and the governor.
Well, perhaps we can have some sort of session to find out how we can create a people-run Seabury Commission.
That's a great example. Yes, ma'am. Just identify yourself. And we'll
Sure.
close.
My name's Allison Sesso. I'm with the Human Services Council, but I'm also a student here at the MPA program.
Good.
I just was a little confused. You talked about this strategy in terms of getting the commuter tax back. You said that
Please call it community use fee.
community user fee. You're right, it is a user fee. But you said that you're trying to get people who want to campaign down here and get fundraising and things like that and get them sort of on board. But you also, you obviously realize that the people in charge there are the three men in the room. So, I think that a better strategy might be to try and get them to want it somehow, to get them, because getting these individuals, unfortunately, these people don't have any power, even if they're elected.
The only way you can get to be speaker, like I was, or president of the Senate, is to have a majority vote of the legislators there.
Right.
If a block of legislators who represent the city of New York, there are 7 Republican senators, who incidentally all voted against the community use fee, so this is not political. All right, they all voted against it, so, I don't want to cast any aspersions on it. But if those 7 would say, not only are we going to vote against this, but we want to put a bill in, and we want to pass this bill. And if the Democrats on the other side of on the Assembly went to the Speaker and said, we want to pass this thing, their leadership depends on their votes. And I think that's the only way to do it. And incidentally, they come to the city of New York and raise a lot of money, too.
Right.
The big 3.
Right.
I think, Stan, that's it. Thank you very, very much. I appreciate it. It was a great idea.
Let me just make one comment in response to this young lady's question. To get the 3 individuals in Albany to pay more attention to what they do in the closed room is we have to change the percentage of New Yorkers who vote. They're sensitive to the fact that there's a block of voters who are here and who will not look favorably on closed room decisions that penalize us. They will change their voting pattern. We had a program here yesterday. There's over 1.6 million New Yorkers who are eligible to vote who don't vote. They're not registered, they don't vote. We need to change that. I just want to remind everybody that the next installment of this series will be the 17th of February in 2004. So I hope you can put that on your calendar. You'll get another invitation from us. And I look forward to seeing you next year. Peter, thank you.